personality disorders that causes people to kill, which directly goes against his standard, I'm going to say there's some sort of conflict of interest there. We wouldn't expect a good God to do that. Does that specification help, or do you not think so?
No. Well, it helps me understand the position better. I don't think it helps support the position well. Yeah. So when I think about this, and I can explain this in sort of intuitive terms, because I think doing the whole like asking for an argument or just giving syllogisms, it got really boring to me. In intuitive terms, it's just like it makes sense why God would create bad people and then set moral standards, right? Because if God, had some sort of desire for people to be a specific way, and just created them that way, well, moral standards for people wouldn't exist, right? It actually wouldn't make sense for God to set these standards and then create people to follow these standards, because otherwise the standards are set for no reason, right? The whole point of the standards that God sets, and I mean, they teach you this in Islam and Christianity and Judaism, is that despite these sort of innate temptations that we have, we're supposed to
Mhm.
have some sort of will or whatever. And this will is supposed to be following these standards, right? Like that's the things that we should do, right? It just wouldn't make sense for God to set standards if everybody was going to do good things. Like what are these standards even telling people?
Oh,
They're not
I
giving you
understand.
information or motivation
Are
or anything.
you? I just want to just clarify so I make sure that I understand your point here. Are you saying that the only reason these standards exist in the first place is because people have agency to choose what standards to follow or not, and lacking that agency, if there was no agency, then setting standards would be redundant. Is that kind of the argument?
Yeah.
Yeah, I generally have two kind of problems with what I'm going to label as the free will argument here. So I guess problem number one, and it's a little bit different from what I've described up to this point, but it seems as if evil exists in the world that goes against God's standard that has nothing to do with free will existing whatsoever. So if one of the standards of God is that human beings are supposed to worship God and follow God's will, well then there needs to be some sort of explanation for stillborn babies, for example, or babies that die of cancer pretty much before they have a chance to do those sort of things or live up to those standards. It doesn't seem as if those conditions existing, it doesn't seem as if those contribute to free will, because those babies don't have a free will to act upon. They're just kind of fucked from the beginning. That's kind of problem number one that I have with the free will argument. And then I think problem number two is that, well, wouldn't we just acknowledge that a world that has no free will would be preferable to a world that has free will, and that a world that has no free will could just have purely good outcomes, right? And could purely fall
All right.
in
So
accordance with good outcomes.
there are two problems there. So I'll address the latter point because I think that's something more relevant to generally the general discussion. Saying like, oh, this is more preferable or whatever is only indexed to the sort of desires that we have, right? Like, yeah, I would agree. I would
Mhm.
rather live in a world with no free will, right? But saying I would rather live in a specific world doesn't really say much about whether God is doing good or not, right? So it could be the case that I would prefer something and it not be good. I feel like that's pretty obvious. There are things that I know that I prefer aren't good. I mean, I could list examples, but I'm sure everybody is aware of the fact that there are things that they prefer that aren't good, except like losers or whatever who are like expressivists.
Sure.
Yeah, and then the second one is just that like yeah, like these sort of natural phenomena that occur or whatever where babies die. Like again, this actually fits in with free will because the entire point of giving people free will and then putting them into the world is that God isn't like interfering with their circumstance, right? And if God is going to interfere with the circumstance after creation and cause these people to have like some sort of quote unquote maximization of free will and not just exist in the way that he's already created them, well, I mean it wouldn't really be very free, would it? Like I it seems weird to be like, oh, like these people who are robbed of their free will because they die actually makes them more free. But I mean that actually kind of is the entire point of free will, is that
Mhm.
the sorts of things that happen aren't within God's control or interference, right? They're within his control in that he created the world, but not within his control in that he currently interferes in it.
Right. May I?
Yeah, you go
So,
ahead.
yeah, for sure. So I don't think that we can just limit free will to be exclusively things that God doesn't interfere with, because there's still going to be an element of, well, for a baby that dies at birth because the mother is using and abusing drugs and alcohol during the labor of pregnancy, I mean, that baby does not have the free will. It died because of the choices of the mother. So it may not be subject to God's interference, but it was subject to another being, that being the mother's interference. So I'm still going to say that there's an absence of free will there, and so appealing to free will wouldn't actually excuse God in this circumstance. I guess that's number
I
one.
don't. Maybe I'm
I
just
actually
wait.
want
Hold
to
on.
focus on this
Wait,
point.
real quick.
Yeah,
I want to focus on this
go
point
for it.
too because I'm just confused what you mean by free will. Like when I say free will, all I mean is that somebody has the will to make decisions, right? And it's like, yeah, like babies, if we consider them past the point of agency or whatever, because obviously I'm sure we agree that there are babies that aren't past the point of agency, like in the first trimester of being a fetus or
Mhm.
whatever. Once we consider them past the point of agency, they do have free will. Whether that free will is temporary or not isn't relevant. They have free will. Like I'm just confused on what your definition of free will is. If it's just if it's going to be precluding, babies or young people who die. Because I mean, all people die. It would be silly to be like, oh, this 80-year-old person doesn't have free will because they died at 80 years old.
No, I understand that. What I'm trying to say is that when we're looking at, okay, is it evil by God's standards for a baby to die at birth and therefore not have the ability to worship God or serve God as he desires? I think what we're trying to find out is that evil, does the existence of that evil get excused because the baby's agency is being supported, right? Are those things happening? Like,
Yeah,
do you think that that's a relevant
so
part of the argument?
so when God says that something is evil, right? Obviously God, and this is just taught in all religious like
Mhm.
schools, classes, churches. When God says something is evil, obviously that thing has to be, or the person that's doing that evil thing has to have the agency not to do it, right? So yeah, like again, all religious schools will teach you this or whatever. I'm not trying to be condescending. I know
Right.
some people haven't been in those spaces and aren't aware of that. Is that, yeah, like God isn't going to say something like, well, a baby not supporting or worshiping God is evil, because that baby does have agency in some way, right? It does have free will in some way, but it doesn't have the agency to make that specific decision to support God because it isn't aware of God. It doesn't have the resources to, do that.
Yeah, to clarify, sorry,
The
really
same
quickly
thing.
to clarify,
Same thing.
my fault. I'm just trying to cut you
Oh no,
off too
you
much,
got
and
it.
I appreciate that you're not trying to be condescending. I don't take you to
No,
be
of course.
condescending here. Like what I'm calling evil, I'm not calling the baby evil for not worshiping God or serving God, just to be clear. What I'm calling evil is the fact that the baby died before it had the chance to, and what I'm saying is evil is that the baby dying was a direct byproduct of the mother abusing drugs and abusing alcohol, something which directly falls outside of the baby's free will. The baby's free will did not constitute its death. The mother did. Therefore, it didn't
Yeah,
have free will in its
to be
death, and
clear,
the creation of
when we
evil
say
was not a
free
creation of
will,
free will.
yeah. When I say free will, free will doesn't mean you have control over all of the things that happen to you. Free will just means that you have control over the decisions you make, right? So, yeah, like a baby
Yeah,
has control. Once a baby passes the point of agency, it has control over the decisions it makes, right? It can move around. It can move its arms up and down. It can suck on titties or milk bottles or whatever, right? Like these decisions, the baby has control over, right? The baby doesn't have control over its circumstance, right? So the circumstance in which it's in, whether it's drug abused, its mother drug abused it and died or whatever, or killed it, whatever. Like these circumstances around it aren't precluding its free will. Precluding isn't the right word, but you understand what I mean. It's not excluding it from
yeah,
having.
for sure.
It's just excluding it from having like agency to do specific actions. Like that's all. But
Mhm.
that doesn't mean that that baby doesn't have free will. It just means that the actual actions that its will can extend to are like limited.
Yeah, I got you. I guess what I'm trying to argue is, I don't know, I think this is the right term for this, but I'm saying that even if we accept like a compatibilist worldview where agents have free will in some circumstances but don't have free will in other circumstances, I still think that this would be compatible with my argument, even if we accept this. Because I don't think it's fair to just say, well, the baby has free will in general, kind of in the general sense that it can kind of choose its own path or whatever, can make certain decisions on its own. Therefore, the evil being produced by it dying before it can serve God, therefore that's excused by free will.
Well, to be
What we
clear,
have to specifically
wait,
look at
I'm
is
just
there
real
is
quick.
the yeah, go for it. Yeah, go for it. My fault.
When you said the evil being, no, you're good. When you said the evil being produced by it dying, like when we say something is evil, that's just an action that you should not do. Like something that's bad or something that's evil is an action that you shouldn't do, right? So when we say something is evil, it doesn't really make sense to say like a natural disaster, like stillborn babies who die of cancer or just die because they didn't make it out, right? These babies dying is not like quote unquote evil. Like evil just extends to actions, right? If we want to say something like it's not preferable or whatever, that's fine. But I don't think it would make sense to say like an all good God would do something which is preferable to everybody, right? Because it also wouldn't
Yeah,
make sense
to
to be
be
like, because people
oh
have
my fault,
contradicting
bro.
preferences. Yeah, I mean that's all. People have contradicting preferences. It wouldn't make sense to be like an all good God would do something which is preferable to everybody because an all good God wouldn't do things that are contradictory. That's logically impossible.
No, I agree that like when we're talking about evil, we're talking about like actions that are committed by people. What I'm saying is evil is that the mother's committing an evil action, at least by God's standard,
Mhm.
when she abuses drugs and drinks because she's depriving the baby of the chance to worship and serve God in a way that God would desire of it. I think we both agree that that's evil by God's
Yep.
standard. What I'm saying is that God created the circumstances, right, in that the biology behind drug abuse and alcohol abuse leading to stillborn, or sorry, rather just general pregnancy complications. God would have created those circumstances by virtue of him being the creator of everything. And not only did he create those circumstances, but that evil being carried out is directly negating the baby's free will to have the choice to serve God, right, and to follow God in his ways. So what I'm saying is, yes, the mother can have the free will to commit that evil action, but that evil action only has those evil outcomes because God created the conditions for it, and that action in question is negating the baby's free will to do something that God wants it to do. That's why I'm saying I don't think that the free will justification is a great defense for the
Okay,
evil
yeah.
that exists in
So
the world.
so let me just kind of steal in this argument real quick, just so I fully understand, or maybe this will just help both of us understand. Is what you're saying that God is causing things to happen that He doesn't want to happen? Is that, am I understanding that correctly?
I would say through like an enabler sense, yeah.
Okay, that's fine. I would agree that like God is causing things to happen that He doesn't want to happen. But again, like we're not having a conversation about whether God's preferences extend over the world or whatever. Like I agree that there are probably things that happen in the world that God prefers not to happen. If we mean preference in some broad or non super specific sense, all the only thing that I'm making is that like it makes sense for our world to exist if God is omnibenevolent, right? So again, like saying like, okay, well, steelman to this position would be that God is doing things that God doesn't want to, and God can't be omnibenevolent, therefore. But God can be omnibenevolent, therefore. Like God can be doing things that are all good, or God can be doing all of the things that He should do, or creating the world as He should.
Can I ask you a question really
Well,
quickly? I just want to
not
make sure I
desiring
understand.
that. I mean, that's all.
Yeah, I just want to make sure I ask you a question. So when you say that God does things that He doesn't want to, the thing that He doesn't want to in question, we're saying that like God does things that lead to like evil, right? Like things that go against His moral standard, correct? That's what we're referring to.
Yeah, like his moral standard for humans. Yeah, like I wouldn't say that he does things that go against his own moral standard or whatever. Because when we say like God has his own moral standard, that quote unquote own moral standard, is just gonna be like all good things. Like God just
No,
does like all good things. God
I
doesn't
don't
do
know if I agree. So like when I say that it's not just human moral standards I'm appealing to. When I say that God created the conditions for drinking and taking drugs during pregnancy to lead to child death, when I say that God created those complications, right? He created the foundations for those things to exist as they do. That directly leads to consequences of children dying before they're born and therefore not being able to live up to God's moral standard, which does seem to go against God's moral standard, right? I'm saying it
No,
goes against His own morals as well.
yeah, I think
You
you might be
disagree with
confused
that?
a little bit. So, well, again, when we say like this is quote unquote going against his own morals, like the quote unquote own morals that we've set forth are standards for other people to behave, right? So imagine that I say something like, and just laying it out because I think it's an intuitive example. Imagine I say something to a little kid, or maybe my kid,
Mhm.
right? Imagine I'm trying to teach my kid about the world, and I say something to them like, hey, you can never steal from other people. Stealing from other people is always bad, right? And that's a moral standard I've set forth for my kid. And if they steal, I'm going to be disappointed in them, right? But then I go and I steal something, right? Maybe it's because, somebody stole it from me first and I steal it back, but that's still going against the standard I've laid forth. No, sorry, somebody sent me a dim. That's still going against the standard that I've laid forth for this other person, right? But that standard doesn't exist for me. I'm not laying forth that standard for me because I'm a different person in a different circumstance with different abilities. So the idea is just that like the things that God's gonna do are not gonna follow the same standard that the things that humans are gonna do, because God is omnibenevolent, omniscient, and omnipotent, whereas humans are not. They're not even like remotely similar to God. Like obviously the standards for behavior are going to be wildly different.
I don't think this is quite analogous, but of course, like I'm definitely willing to hear you out, like and like hear you clarify why it might be analogous, and I'm just missing it. But I think like what it's more so doing is God tells you, hey, murder is wrong. You should not murder. If you want to enter my kingdom of heaven, you're not going to kill your neighbor. But then not only does God create the conditions in the world for people to die if a bullet rips through their head, but He places a gun at your doorstep, or He places a gun right by you, knowing full well that there's somebody that you very much hate and you have very much murderous thoughts about. I think that's much more analogous. And in that sort of analogy, I would say, well, yeah, if God's directly enabling you to commit actions that He said were morally incorrect for you to commit based upon His moral standard, He's creating evil, or at the very least, He's enabling the evil that you create. And I would say that that would be
God is
worthy of
creating the
condemnation on
yeah,
God's side.
saying God is creating the circumstances for which evil to exist is like, yeah, we've established that. I just don't. This doesn't extend to God being evil, like at all. It just doesn't. Like
So,
God does things that are good.
okay, go for it.
Good things. Yeah, some of the good things that He does are creating the circumstances for evil to exist, and allowing people to choose whether to be evil or not. Like, I mean, that's it.
So what moral standard then do we judge God by, if you wouldn't mind?
I don't think we have some sort of like set moral standard that we can judge God by. Like all that I'm saying, or the sort of normative claim that I'm making is very non-specific and very broad, which is just God is doing the things that God should do, right? And I have some sort of like intuitionistic view, right? I wouldn't call myself a naturalist because, obviously I think God isn't a natural being. So I have like a non-naturalistic intuitionistic view about the sort of moral standards that God holds. But yeah, obviously it's going to be wildly different for humans. Like I think humans, we should probably judge in like a utilitarian lens or something like that. And there might be some sort of
Oh,
like threshold ontological view that I might be sympathetic towards, but
okay.
yeah, I don't know. God is like an omnipotent, omnibenevolent, like omniscient being. And I think it's just ridiculous to be like, yeah, like these sorts of moral standards that humans hold or that God holds towards humans, we should judge God by, because God is
Yeah.
a completely
Well,
different
here's
being.
my thing.
It might be
Here's my thing.
just real quick.
Okay,
It
go
might
ahead.
be the case that, because I think it also helps with scale, right? It might be the case that, for example, like if we look at like environmental things, right? If I want to keep like an ant farm, for example, there are conditions that I can put the ants in to be quote unquote happier, right? So for example, I was looking at this recently. You can put ants in like a gel farm, right? A gel farm is literally just gel that the ants can go through. They won't live very long, but they'll be very happy because the gel stimulates some sort of receptor in their brain that I can't remember the name of. But they won't live very long, and it won't help their civilization actually thrive, right? Whereas if you put them in a dirt farm with sufficient nutrients or whatever, the ants actually will thrive. They'll thrive in a way more robust way. So the better decision, is actually to put the ants in this dirt farm, despite the fact that they're not going to experience as much like quote unquote happiness, or it's not going to be as preferable for them in the short term. And the point being is just that the scale that God is on is so incomprehensible and large, that what we consider the best decision from our perspective is like minuscule and pointless to even try and apply.
Yeah, I think I understand that. It's just my thing is, so there's two standards that I've been kind of appealing to throughout this conversation. So there's standard number one, which I think you don't very much care about, which I think is fair, is that through the human perspective of what we deem to be moral, it seems like there's a lot of criticism you can levy against God. But of course, that's not necessarily going to be the most relevant standard. Standard number two is that when God tells us that he upholds certain moral values, but then he creates the conditions and environment for these moral values to be kind of violated, that would be another kind of appealment that I've been making to say, okay, God is worthy of criticism through this way. But it seems like what you're saying is that neither of these moral standards are sufficient to criticize God. And maybe you can clarify in case I'm misrepresenting you. But earlier it sounded like you said there was no moral standard that you actually hold God to. But my question, my confusion is, if there is no moral standard that we hold God to, or at the very least, if there's no one that you understand or know about, then how can you make the claim that that God is omnibenevolent without having some sort of standard to compare him to kind of dictate his omnibenevolence being true? That's what's confusing me right now.
That's actually the thing, is it's like in God's nature, right? So when God lays out moral standards, if you read like I haven't read the Quran or the Torah, but in the Bible, when God lays out moral standards, he lays them out very broadly. God doesn't lay out some sort of descriptivist view about morals or some sort of like cognitive propositional view that I'm aware of. It's very broad, and the sorts of things that he says are you should do this, you should do that, right? So the only thing that I can imagine that we can apply to God, and I don't even know if it's fair to apply to God, but I mean, I would imagine it is these sorts of should statements, right? We have this sort of like intuitionistic should, right? I don't have an exact view on what the word should means. It's like a semantic primitive to me, right? In the same way that I don't know if I could exactly define, what what like a table or like a chair is. You know what I mean? Like if you ask me,
No,
like,
I understand what you mean. Like you just
yeah,
know. You just
sorry,
know
I don't mean to
yeah.
condescend or like yeah, it's just the idea of a semantic primitive, right? Is that I don't know that I can give you an exact definition, despite the fact that I could give you like several properties or things that relate to it generally. But that's the standard that I'm judging it by. And I think the idea to me is that, well, I think the problem of evil is like fair. There's like some sort of intuitive thing there. I just don't think it's a very good standard to judge the actual. I don't think it's a very good standard to judge the actual epistemic merit of God on. I think if we want to judge the epistemic merit of God, we should generally do it on a metaphysical basis because it's a strongly metaphysical claim in nature. I think these sorts of claims about like
So
good
I'm a
or
little
evil.
confused.
Yeah,
Okay. My
I
fault.
just
Go
wanted
ahead.
to say I think these sorts of claims about good or, and I know I'm rambling, so I'll finish up. I think these sorts of claims about good or evil just are very broad and aren't very specific and are hard to actually judge strongly metaphysically on or give us much metaphysical grounding one way or the other.
So I just want to. So there's kind of two things. So I just want to make sure I understand your argument right. So to summarize, are you basically getting at number one, you're not necessarily sure that you can give like a definition or like exactly define what like shoulds are or like good or bads are, and then number two, it's just of God's nature to be good, and that's not something that really needs to be defined or explained thoroughly. It's just something that we kind of know. Is that kind of where you're going with that?
Well, it's something that we kind of know because that's how we define God, right? So that there are like complex reasons why that's like a crucial aspect of the definition of God, right? But um, I mean, obviously, the more important metaphysical properties that God is omniscient and omnipotent. But again, like there are really complex arguments in the literature for why like omnibenevolence is going to be
Yeah.
like something that's required for God, or makes more sense intuitively for the sort of God that we're talking about.
Okay.
Also, real
I
quick, I
think
just
my
want to address some
final.
chat. Wait,
Oh,
wait,
go
wait, just
for
real
it.
quick. Somebody just said, "Ain't you monkey boyfriend?" I want this person to kill themselves. I hate monkey boy is the worst person
Oh,
ever. So,
Jesus Christ.
yeah,
I
sorry.
Monkey was a
disavow.
retard,
But
and
like
everybody. Yeah.
I did want to say though. So I agree with you that there is some. I think the term for it is non-inferential knowledge, right? Is that the term for it?
Well, it's going to be inferential. It's just going to be like non-deductive inferential. I think it's like
Or
non-monotonistic.
yeah. So like I understand that like these forms of like understanding are going to exist, but like my understanding of how they exist is that we just have these kind of broad intuitions about the world, through the experiences that we have in life, and we kind of absorb them in to kind of have this knowledge. So I get that those things exist, but it's really hard to accept that they would exist in this circumstance when it seems like the intuition doesn't point that way, right? Like when we try to say that there's an omnibenevolent God, but we live in a world just full of evil and horror, those sorts of intuitions aren't going to occur for everybody. And I know that you said that human intuition is not going to invalidate God as a omnibenevolent being, and I kind of agree. But if what we're appealing to is going to be largely based around whether or not we gather this kind of knowledge through our intuition, and our intuitions don't seem to point that way, at least not for everybody, I wonder how we reconcile that problem.
Well, I think we reconcile that problem by just making these sorts of intuitive, like thought experiments, right? So, I mean, I like the ant one. I like the idea of scale. I think that's pretty intuitive. I think people can understand that one pretty well. But I mean, the most intuitive is just to say that like the things that an omnibenevolent being should do are going to be like wildly different from the things that like humans should do. Or sorry, not just an omnibenevolent, but a triomni. I'm just going to use triomni because it's easier to say. Like a triomni like being should do are going to be like wildly different from the things that humans should do, and that trying to apply human standards to them is probably naive and silly. And I think the sorts of claims that we should make are the claims that will actually give us like strong credence one way or the other towards God existing, should be like strong metaphysical claims, because if these moral claims that you're making don't have strong metaphysical grounding, which I think we both agree that they don't, because you said you don't hold a strong meta-ethical view, the actual metaphysical basis for like God existing is probably not going to be very inductively supported one way or the other. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it makes sense. I just think that what you're talking about is going to be more so broadly applied, right? So I would say broadly, I agree that we're not going to hold the same intuitive standards of morality as an omnibenevolent being would. However, when a specific omnibenevolent being like the Christian God or the Islamic God descends to us or tries to give revelations to us, and they have a more specific criteria for what's good and bad, well, then that gets really tricky. Because even if we agree that in general,
That's the thing, though,
wait, go
real
for
quick.
it.
If we agree that in general we're not going to apply the sort of standards that we have to these beings, well, yeah, the standards that these beings give to us are still the standards that we have, because these beings never say anything. I mean, you'll never read in the Bible something like, yeah, this is wrong for you guys to do and me to do. God will always almost specifically
No, I understand that.
for you
I
to
was
do. Yeah, you should not do this. And often it's
yeah.
applied in a very specific scenario. It's like often pretty context dependent. So
Well, I
yeah,
understand. I understand. Wait, more so just to make sure that we're being as productive as possible. I agree with that. What I'm saying is that those beings shouldn't be held to those standards, but we still need to determine who those beings are and who those beings aren't. That's like more so what my issue would be. So if you want to say, and also I want to make a little bit of a quick.
wait, real
I want
quick,
to make.
what that means. Who
Oh
those
yeah,
beings
I can clarify. So yeah, I can clarify. So, like, when we get kind of certain revelations from specific gods, be it the Christian God or the Islamic God, well, when they lay claim to the fact that they're omnibenevolent, or when their apostles or prophets, etc., lay claim to the fact that they're omnibenevolent, we still have to make that determination on if that's actually a true statement or not. And in that case, it doesn't seem like knowing that omnibenevolent beings aren't going to act as we typically would isn't going to help us get any further in determining who's actually omnibenevolent and who isn't. It doesn't seem very useful in those circumstances. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I agree. I think that's why, instead of judging a god based on its omnibenevolence feature, and saying that the omnibenevolence feature gives us this sort of inductive reason not to believe it, which is what you were saying, that it, if we don't have these sort of specific standards for morality to judge it by, we should probably be ambivalent about the omnibenevolence feature, until there's like more philosophical grounding, which there is, and that's why I'm not ambivalent about it. But I don't want to get into that because that's a whole different conversation. But the sort of thing that you're putting forth, I think you should be ambivalent about, and then judge God based on its philosophical merits, metaphysical merits. Does that make sense? Like, you understand what I'm saying there?
Yeah, I understand what you're saying. Like, as opposed to outright rejecting that these gods exist or that these gods are only benevolent.
It's like if we don't have any sort of standard by which to judge God by, and we're just saying this omnibenevolence characteristic, like you said, this omnibenevolence characteristic, we don't really know how to apply, or it's just confusing how to apply because we don't have these standards to judge God by. Well, you should just be ambivalent about it. It shouldn't give you inductive reason not to believe in God. Like, do you agree with that?
So, when we say not to believe in God, just to clarify, we're saying like to remain agnostic about God as opposed to being like a firm atheist, right?
Yeah, or even it's not even just being a firm atheist, but I'm sure we agree that you can have like some credence towards God existing. Like, I can have more credence towards the idea that God doesn't exist than that he does, rather than just being completely.
I think the ambivalent stance would probably still be somewhat consistent, and I genuinely think this with agnosticism with respect to believing or not believing in God, simply because omnibenevolence is not going to be a convincing factor in me believing in God any more than I already do. So I think I would still remain agnostic.
I agree. Right? I agree. That's actually what I'm saying. So just to be clear, the original sort of thing that we were talking about was you said the problem of evil gives you some reason not to believe in God, like, and I asked, okay, specifically like inductively or deductively, and you said inductively, and we even clarified further in the conversation when you said, well, it's non-inferential, and I said, well, I think it's like non-monotheistic, right? Which just means it's inferential in a non-deductive way. So you agreed that it would give you some reason early in the conversation, and not to like argue that you're like inconsistent or whatever. I just want to be clear. You agreed early in the conversation that it would give you some inductive reason not to believe in God, the omnibenevolence characteristic. But do I understand now that you're agreeing that the omnibenevolence characteristic just gives you reason to be ambivalent and not actually inductive reason against the proposition that God exists?
Yeah, what I'm saying is I genuinely don't see like a substantial difference between those two things. The reason being that, to me, if I have reason to be ambivalent towards a certain feature of God, then to me that suggests that, okay, that's one quality off the checklist of God that I don't have to worry about anymore in terms of being persuaded to become a believer or not. So like what I'm trying to understand is what's like the meaningful difference between that and having a reason to remain agnostic, and that one of the qualities of God is off the checklist now.
Yeah, it's off the checklist in that it doesn't actually influence the belief for or against God. Is that, am I clear on that?
Yeah, but isn't that just agnostic?
Yeah. I just want to be clear, by the way. That was funny in chat. I just want to be clear, by the way. At the beginning of the conversation, you were saying that the problem of evil is an inductive reason not to believe in God, and right now you're saying it's just a reason to be ambivalent. So, like, I just want to be clear that you got dogged on. You changed your position, and you're actually awful at debate, and I hate you.
Oh wow.
No, I'm kidding. I love you, Forks. But I just wanted to.
No, I got you.
I'm trying to be good faith, but I also want to be super clear that like you did change your position in the debate, and that's all I wanted to like get clear on.
Yeah, I'm just the clarifier here. You actually did change your position there, Forks.
Thank you, Goons. I believe now.
Yeah, I'm just the guy that clarifies. So yeah, I got you.
Hold on, Goons. Jesus, dog.
It's not Goons, it's Goons, by the way.
I said Goons. I think I said Goons. My fault if I didn't. Yeah, I will say I think it's a bit of a softer position that I'm holding now than I did at the start. I'll say is that because like okay, I don't know if I fully. I have to stew on it. That's what I'm saying. I have to stew on it, but I do think it's a softer position. Do you think that's satisfying enough, or?
Yeah, it's satisfying enough to say that I won the debate, and you're terrible. Holy shit! Get out of the fucking debate scene, you scumbag.
Wow, Jesus.
No. He actually does need to take like a rhetorical hiatus for sure.
No. Forks very much very good faith.
I don't know where the hate comes from Goons, but yeah, I appreciate.
Oh, it's not hatred. It's just like advice. It's actually the opposite of hatred.
I know you're just a pretty toxic person. I'm just gonna local mute you. You're very weird.
No, don't local mute. Come on, that's troll.
All right,
wait. Does anybody know who this Marcus guy is in chat? I just want to call him out for being a retard.
Oh no. These are like they have like an infinite amount of these like random retards to just say random shit.
Wait, I just want to point out in chat. He was like, "You're using basic ass reasoning," and I
no. Like these are literally like these aren't even like humans. These don't even like acknowledge these beings.
It's like an AI account. You're using basic reasoning. You suck, dude. Goons, apparently you got clapped by infinity.
Got clapped by infinity.
You're cooked. Can we get Marcus to unmute and talk to Goons?
No, Marcus is like a solidified text cuck.
Wait,
Is the
Marcus,
debate
Marcus,
over?
are you gonna mute? The debate is over. Marcus, are you gonna unmute? Dude, holy shit! What a bitch.
Wait, Mason. Mason,
Hey, what's up?
have I ever interacted with you before?
I have no idea who you are, so
I have no idea who you are either, but you're such a good debater. You did such a good job.
That's actually.
Are you getting like lol out right now?
I appreciate that, bro. Do you have like an ASMR channel? Is this like advertising?
No, I don't do any ASMR. I don't really. The only ASMR I know is like those black women eating like crab legs. I don't know.
Have you ever eaten crab legs into a mic very quietly?
No. I think if I'm paying for crab legs, I'm gonna eat those hoes loud as shit. But if people want to eat them quietly, they can.
What if eating them quietly into a mic paid for the next crab legs? Would you do it?
I guess, yeah, if I didn't have my job. Yeah. I don't know.
All right. Well, that's all I wanted to ask.
Yeah. I appreciate you asking that. I like being interacted with. And you just made me very happy.
Do we have any non-vegans that are willing to defend that non-vegan position?
Oh my god. Good question. Dude, everyone is a bitch in this server. Especially this Marcus guy. He just refuses to unmute.
I'll debate anything, but just know you're going to get very frustrated talking to me.
Damn, bro.
She's like a high-level troll.
Goons, you didn't answer my question, by the way.
What was the question?
What's your type of women?
I don't have a type.
Wait, that's just not true.
Are you sure? Are you sure you don't have a type?
And like no, I definitely don't.
See, he's lying. I actually know his type.
What makes you think you don't have a type? Like, why do you think that?
Have you dated any fat women?
Do you like men?
No, I haven't dated any fat men. I'm generally not attracted to fat women either.
Oh, so you do have a type and you're just lying.